Hi, everyone. We're very excited to host the Whistle EdTech expert panel. We're going to be covering the topic of how to bring your EdTech product to market. We're fortunate enough to have with us a variety of consultants, investors, product designers, fundraisers, as well as experts from the industry itself to shed light on this topic. We're going to start by just letting each person introduce themselves and give us a bit of background. So without further ado, Rayna, Glumac, I'd love to learn a little bit about you, your experience in this space, and what do you think makes it so interesting to be a part of in 2024?
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. My name is Rayna Glumac. I run a firm called Rye Consulting. We also run Rye Collective. Our work really focuses on helping companies, we say pre-K to gray, so early childhood through adult learner, engage in the education market. My background, I'm a former classroom teacher, then went on, did a law degree, policy work on the Hill before starting Rye a decade ago. And I think truly coming from the classroom is really what my passion when we look at education. We have gone through a lot with the pandemic and where we come out of it, pro and con. We've got a lot of funding going on here in the US. I think a lot of people are interested in looking how they can attract and be a part of, but how that funding was implemented definitely dictated some of the outcomes that we're seeing and how we're actually looking at purchasing and bringing in new products into classrooms. So really excited to discuss more of that today and kind of those trends that we're seeing in the US purchasing that's happening in go-to-market for 2024.
Amazing. And with us as well, talking about insight on trends, is Benoit Wirz from Brighteye VC. And Benoit, just love to get a bit of background, what attracts you about the space, share with us a little bit of background about yourself and what you guys are doing at Brighteye.
Sure. No, thanks for having me, David. And so I'm a partner with a fund called Brighteye. Brighteye is the most active EdTech-focused venture capital fund in Europe. We have 150 million under management across two funds and have been investing since 2017. I actually started investing in EdTech back in 2010 with a foundation called the Knight Foundation, and I've kind of lived the growth of EdTech in the US initially, and then realized that a lot of the trends that were making EdTech a more exciting place to invest in the US were also true in Europe. And as of 2016, when we started thinking about Brighteye, there were really no funds focused on the space. So we figured if we could, get excited, or sorry, if we could be the first to plant a flag around the sector in Europe, we could get great entrepreneurs to take our money, even though we were a startup and nobody had heard of us before. And we would help the startups that we invested in, particularly with internationalization across Europe and North America, which are the markets that we know best. So that's kind of what we've been up to. I think what excites me about EdTech is just, it's a tremendously underserved market in so many ways. I think technology, although it's certainly not a panacea for learning, can when used judiciously and well, can really accelerate the way that people learn and obviously help them realize their potential and honestly generate a lot of return for both entrepreneurs and investors.
And I think, just talking about EdTech and trying to understand a bit more about the industry and where it's going. Rayna, I know you do a lot of work and you come from both sides. You've been at both sides of the industry, both from inside the classroom and then selling or assisting to sell into the classroom. So just as we look at the year to come, what are some of the challenges that EdTech companies need to think about or opportunities that they should be aware about that you see and that they should be preparing for?
Yeah, I think the headlines read fiscal cliff. I wouldn't say that's where we're heading. It's more of a plateau. The big thing that's referring to is our ESSER funds, our ESSER, emergency relief dollars. So here in the US, a lot of our funding to date has been ESSA, which is your Title I, Title II, IDEA funds. We've had them for a very long time. Our school districts are very skilled on how to use them. There's clear boundaries and definitions of what each fund is allocated to. Title II goes to professional learning, right? The ESSER, our emergency relief dollars, were the ones that kind of went fiscally a different cycle. So ESSA is always kind of a June 30th and the new cycle begins. ESSER is September 30th, and these funding was supposed to be up September 30th of 2024. We have, of course, our government has given an extension. We're now looking somewhere early 2026-ish, depending on what you're doing. And this is where we're claiming this cliff is happening. The big difference between our ESSA and ESSER dollars is how the money is being passed out. It's actually a reimbursement process. So school districts have to file, go through that process, go back to their state district. Of course, everyone's doing it differently to get the funding reimbursed to them. And that's requiring a lot more paperwork. So what we're seeing is a huge increase in what we do here in the US called procurement. So our procurement process, schools, our government entities, they use our federal tax dollars, and we want to make sure they're being accountable in doing that process. So prior to the pandemic, we had this June 30th fiscal. Procurement was brought in if your price point was over a certain area, on average about 25,000. So it was more than that. We had to be fiscally responsible and go through procurement. Post-pandemic, we've seen this huge growth of funding that has come through, but a lot more structure around how we use that funding. So we no longer really use that threshold of $25,000 because of that paperwork that's required. The school districts are really thoughtful. They want the ed tech companies, whether you're US and understand what's going on or global, to be a part of that paperwork. So they're having them do all of those extra pieces through the procurement process. And then the outcome is you're usually put on what we call a bid or a hunting license. And so a lot of instructional tools, supplemental curriculum are kind of getting on this like hunting list. So essentially you're getting approved as a vendor in a school district, but that actually doesn't communicate to you getting a direct PO or contract. You then have to do the marketing and sales efforts to close. It just kind of gives you a general approval, which is different than what we saw pre-pandemic. So there's a lot more funding to be had, a little bit more hoops to jump through to get it, and kind of figuring out that process. The other piece that we really see is, in 2013, we called the big boom, right? We had Common Core, which is our unifying of our standards, and SaaS technology, right? You can now download an app in Alabama and use Hawaii or New York all as one. What we're starting to see is states are going to create their own standards. So kind of going into 2028, we see about 34 states have either addressed or will be addressing their standards or adoption process. So it's seeing a lot more fragmented. So how they use their money, how they align to their needs are all shifting. So you no longer have kind of one giant opportunity. It's a lot more fractured. And I think that's going to be a big trend that we're seeing. So there's a lot more funding available, just a lot more hoops to go through, and understanding where that pathway is. I think is going to be a really big hurdle going into 2024. The positive coming out of this is what we learned from the pandemic is I think school districts are much more open to adopting new technology and new engagements any point during the school year. There's no longer this rush that we have to get everything started before the school year starts. We're a lot more open. I think that's a positive that really came out of the pandemic. And I think being used, now everyone's got a laptop, right? And so the ability to have technology and more of a one-to-one engagement in classrooms is a lot more realistic than it was pre-pandemic.
Got a couple follow-up questions just on that. So let's go back to the kind of bid and hunting list, as you called it, or at least that I've written down. What gets you on that list? How do you get approval to get on that list? What's involved in the process? Is it complicated? Do you have to be of a certain caliber? Is this a real concern for an early stage startup?
Great question. So this is the procurement process. We say to work with someone like Rye, and honestly, in general, you should really have 3 to 5 references to get started. But the key thing is kind of that general threshold of procurement. What counts as a reference? That's always my favorite question. And this is where pilots come into play. So big difference here I'm going to do is trial versus pilot. Trial is you're trying something, right? This could be an established company that has a new button or feature. This could be a company who's just kind of figuring out their MVP. Pilot is a full implementation that would be similar to what it would be if they purchased your product, right? We're going to onboard them. We're going to check in. We like to see a pilot to be a minimum of 3 months. Obviously, depends on your product, a little bit of how that goes. But a pilot can be a reference for procurement, right? Because it'll be the same type of product or service that they're going to be purchasing. And so 3 to 5 references is really what we see on average. Most RFPs require at minimum 3 references. So you've got to have that to kind of check the boxes for minimum requirement to pass through the door. To get RFPs, people always ask how to find them. There's a few different ways. Positive of the pandemic, we'll look for the silver lining. A lot of districts went digital. They still might ask you to mail in your submission, but you actually can register on their website. So if you go to any school district website and type in the little search bar, RFP, sales, procurement, you'll get to their procurement site and you can register. Almost every district has a place. And what you'll do is you'll fill out information about your organization. They'll send you emails of RFP opportunities, and then you can pick the ones that are the best to respond to. And there's lots of best practices there, but high level, you want to look at the RFP opportunities that fit for you. These bid hunting list type ones, to be quite honest, you want to think about, have I ever done work in the state before? Do I, as a school in this district, ever looked at us? Are they specifically asking if we meet the minimum requirements before going kind of forward with it? Otherwise, you're just sending everything out to everyone. So you want to be really thoughtful about that process and what it looks like. But ideally, unless you are transparently an LMS system, which is really a spine of a school district, textbooks, state level assessment, we're seeing those are usually where you see a direct to PO contract one winner RFP. Almost everything else these days is going to listing type engagements, this hunting license type application. The other thing to think about is your price point. If you are lower than $10,000 to $15,000, usually I would say do not be a proactive procurement person, be a reactive. Talk to school districts, do your sales and marketing. If they tell you they need an RFP to respond, then go ahead and do the process.
Couple of follow-ups on that.
Yeah.
So very interesting. I would have actually thought it would be the reverse. I would have thought that core solutions would have had to go through, let's say, the bid hunting process, because
they do. But I'm saying those are usually the RFPs where they pick one winner, whereas
okay, I understand.
which is like that PO contract, pick one. But most of the people who I think will probably be on this call will be some sort of supplementary curriculum, right? Or an instructional tool or some kind of add-on. Those folks are mostly going to get listing-based engagements where there's multiple vendors approved and then they kind of go after the school-based sale.
Benoit, just a question for you on that. I don't know what you're seeing out of the portfolio or just in the industry at all, but has that affected pricing or the way they structure pricing or the way that any of your portfolio companies think about going to market in terms of having to now jump through more hoops? Are you seeing that have an effect on any of them at all?
That's a good question. I think, so just to take a step back, I think the kind of fragmentation that Rayna was talking about in the US market is what has always been true in Europe, right? So just to and as a result, it's always been honestly really hard to raise capital for K-12 EdTech companies, because the conventional wisdom is that the closer you get to the classroom, the harder it will be to scale to some degree, right? You're gonna, if you're number one product in Latvia, that doesn't take you very far, and then you need to worry about what the requirements might be for Lithuania and Estonia before you think about Germany or whatever the next market is, right? So that kind of the barriers to sort of classroom adoption can be quite high, and as a result, there are a lot of local champions that get built, and those local champions have a harder time scaling because of all the hoops they need to jump through to become a local champion, basically. And so that being said, I think that the companies that have done best in scaling in Europe are sort of three varieties, basically, if you're looking at K-12 specifically. One, they sort of build software that is not related to the classroom directly. So, admin software, that sort of thing. So there's a company in our portfolio called Stewie, for example, which is operating system for schools. During the pandemic, like many companies, all the tender processes got thrown out the window. They grew quite quickly because they had a messaging app that connected parents and students and teachers, and that was, a priority during the pandemic. I think as those issues receded, they went back to just a much more traditional tender process. The tender process looks, I would say, not exactly the same as what Rayna is describing, but not that dissimilar in the sense that there are various requirements for various jurisdictions, and one of the things they've done most successfully is actually acquire companies, small companies in each of the jurisdictions they're looking to expand to in order to sort of ease the process of expanding into those. So they started in Germany, they acquired a company in Switzerland, in Belgium, in Spain, and they're doing well now in all those jurisdictions. So that's another kind of expansion mechanism, I would say, not quite sales strategy, but not too far from it. And then they cross-sell across the different companies that they have acquired, who often have different product modules. So that's strategy number one is you basically have admin software. It makes it a little bit easier to scale. Strategy number two is you start in one country in Europe, and then you just go straight to the US and you ignore all the other countries in Europe. And so you can look at companies like Kahoot, right? Started in Norway, and then went straight to the US and focused on the US. Labster did a similar thing out of Denmark, focused on universities, but still the same idea where the market was so big in the US. It's a company called Magma out of I believe Sweden. Same idea. And so anyway, that's another strategy. And the third strategy is just sell straight to consumers, and that tends to be much more aligned across countries, because actually, even though each jurisdiction thinks they're very particular, when you talk to students actually don't think that what they're learning is all that different. And so you can look at companies like GoStudent, which is a large tutoring platform here, valued at a couple billion. You can look at No Unity, which is a kind of a TikTok for education way to think about it. They've scaled quite successfully across Europe. Anyway, so I think all those strategies are interesting. They don't and potentially maybe more relevant for various companies. It's not the granular sort of advice that Rayna was providing, but I can say broadly that's what we're seeing. And then we can talk more if you're interested in kinds of the business models that broadly we're seeing working. But yeah, I'll pause there.
Well, yeah, I would want to hear about that, and I also want to hear your take on, out of those strategies from a VC investor perspective, are there any that you see are more attractive or more effective, or does it not necessarily matter?
I think, well, so currently I would say direct to consumer is out of favor, right, among VCs. And so just because the revenues associated with B2B are much more predictable, and schools, once they buy, they're a pain in the butt, honestly, to sell to, but once they're buying, they're much more predictable, right? Even than traditional businesses. And so the trade-off you're making when you're looking at it as an investor is your growth rates will probably be slower because the cost of acquisition of schools is relatively high, but then your churn is relatively low because right. the schools, once they've adopted something, tend to stick with it, honestly, even beyond when they should to some degree, but certainly for longer than a traditional business. And so that's a trade-off that I think is appealing to investors, particularly in the current environment where predictability is more valued than it was 2 or 3 years ago when everything was going nuts in terms of the VC environment. And so I would say of the three models, broadly speaking, that's the 1 and 2 are probably more in favor than 3. That being said, as a venture capitalist, right, what you're looking to do is to look in the direction that nobody else is looking, ideally, right? You have to be contrarian and right, famously. And so to some degree, we're still hunting in all three of those buckets and looking for new buckets that might be interesting, because that's that's where you can sort of have the biggest arbitrage in terms of applying a sector-focused strategy like EdTech. And then just in terms of business models, I mean, so I mentioned I started investing in EdTech in the US in 2010. Between roughly 2011, 2012, and 2016, there was maybe 2012 and 2015, digital penetration in schools went from 20% to 100% virtually in the US, right? There was this massive increase in digital penetration in schools, and which was, and so all of a sudden, right? Like that opportunity honestly looks a little bit like similar to what happened in Europe during COVID, because before COVID, one anecdotal piece of data is that, or one I guess small piece of data is that half of elementary schools in Germany, or half of elementary school teachers in Germany, did not have a school email address prior to 2019, right? Or prior to 2020, rather. And so there was just forget about students, like teachers did not have access to the internet in schools. And so there just wasn't a lot of ways to distribute stuff. That has largely been remedied. But in both those situations, you have this opportunity to produce bottom up, or to create a bottom up sales motion, because there was, teachers had all these devices all of a sudden, and access to internet, and they were just looking for things to put on them, right? This was back in the day. So companies that we invested in back at Knight Foundation, like Newsela, Nearpod, and a few others that were kind of taking advantage of this teachers just having access and being curious about what you could actually put that was useful on these devices. I think now the statistics depend on who you ask, but it's somewhere well north of 1,000 pieces of software, right? That the average school device has, and so breaking through the noise and getting kind of bottom up adoption. Although I still think it's the best and most predictable way, because to go back to why this is a good business option, if you can get teachers' attention, you can convert predictably some percentage of the teachers that use it into paying customers, or at least regular customers, and then you can use the teacher adoption to convert predictably schools, and then you can use school adoption to convert predictably districts, right? Like that motion really worked during that period a lot, right? That was how a lot of these companies first started to scale. And then once you topped out in the bottom up stuff, you could build in the kind of tender process that Rayna was talking about, because you sort of your one growth motion had sort of capped out, started to slow down. You could bring in these other growth motions, but you had all the proof points that Rayna was talking about. You already had that because you were sort of embedded in multiple districts. I think what's happened is, and then the second business model, which is also attractive, is I think when it started to get saturated in schools in the US, some companies pivoted to, okay, well, we'll just give it away for schools or for free to schools if we can get teachers to use it, and then we'll get parents to pay for it. So there's a company called Epic, for example, in our portfolio, which is, you can think about as Netflix for kids' books. They distribute it for free in schools. All these, classrooms were happy to have access to, thousands and eventually tens of thousands of texts that were interesting for kids. They didn't have to pay for, and then if parents wanted access at home, they could use that, right? And that was another motion that kind of proved out, but again, topped out because there are only so many of those things that you can do. And then finally, I think we're now in a situation where it's so competitive that actually the most common sales motion is top down, is just is kind of doing a lot of what Rayna was talking about, which is finding a couple pilot customers just by dialing and sort of getting people's attention as much as you can, and then using that to really build a top-down sales motion that makes sense. I don't have a preference among all those. I think they can all work. Well, sorry, I do have a preference. I like the bottom-up motion. I think it's quite predictable, but I think it's much harder to find in today's environment than it was before. So that's probably more information you needed, but that gives you a sense.
I jokingly call it B to S instead of B to B. Business school is also a little bit of BS. So, that's what we call it. I have to say, I'm super interested in the fact that you like the bottom. I mean, as
me too. Me too. Top down all the way.
Yeah. As an educator, love the idea of teachers having choice and impression and experience to bring towards choosing the solutions in their classroom. I think the hard part that we're finding is you can get a huge amount of teacher users under a free, but the conversion is really difficult. And so you find these early stage companies that had a huge user base, but as soon as they start to convert to that paid model, they really struggle with that growth, and there's a huge drop off because unfortunately in the US, teachers don't have choice and don't have the ability to pay for products in their classroom very rarely. And the other thing we're finding is, and I'd love to hear from this more, is just with the amount of tech that came in during the pandemic, a lot of the CTOs of school districts got really overwhelmed. And that is why they're pushing back now on kind of like that free model. I think Epic is really unique. Love what they do, but the idea of having a book, that works. But when we're seeing like free content and curriculum, what we're seeing is a bigger push, unfortunately, through like that procurement tender, mainly to check, can we to support this tech, right? Is like our school set up to do this? Sure. Is our student information safe and secure? And then like, does it align to our standards, our mission, especially when we're seeing key states like Texas and Florida having so much, we'll nicely say red tape around what they're allowing and empowering in classrooms, that teachers have really lost that voice. As an educator, would love to see more of it. But sadly, when we look at who's making the decisions, it's rarely educators. I mean, the only pro I see out of this huge movement towards more of these listing-based engagements is that we're hoping that teachers are having some sort of voice at the school level to pick, out of this list of pre-approved vendors.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Just to address that, I don't think we don't. I hesitate to say never because I can never. My memory isn't what it was, but I mean, I don't remember anyway ever investing in a company where it's just free, adoption by teachers. Because I think you're right. I think the motion that works, the motion that's repeatable and exciting is when you can see that there's a percentage of those free users that convert to paid, whether it's at the school level or at the teacher level, and then a percentage of the schools that convert to districts. And that motion we have seen, mostly again in a less crowded market where teachers' voices do matter and they can convince administrators that this is a kind of a critical problem, or this is solving a critical problem that they have, and so. It's much rarer than it was, and honestly, the companies that have the most adoption around that are also, I think, just today are currently the most fraught, which is, I know we said we would talk about this at some point, but are AI-driven companies, right? Like those are still seeing, so you can think about Magic School in the US or Knowledge, which is a French company, which Curipod also, actually it was a Norwegian company, but I think expanding most quickly in the US. Those companies are seeing massive adoption. I don't know how much revenue they're generating. We're not investors in any of them. But yeah, and it's the most fraught because honestly, they're all built on third-party models, and so as a result, much less defensible than some others.
Right, and I think the big thing here in the U.S. is we don't really have the boundaries in place yet. So they're building, and we can find out tomorrow that the boundaries cut off half their legs. Right? We don't know. Whereas compared to Europe, at least we're in that conversation. The U.S. we're kind of still, we like to do a lot of discovery before we make a statement. But yeah.
I mean, sorry, just to ask you, I mean, so my impression is like, I would be really worried about companies that are generating content, but I'm much less worried about companies that are essentially helping teachers to generate, administrative responses. I mean, I don't know. Do you think that there's going to be a lot of pushback on this?
Where we're seeing it, just I from a legal perspective, and love Magic School. I helped run the Colorado EdTech community, and they're part of it here. So fantastic what Adil and his team is doing. I think where it's concerned is like when the wrong information gets put into the AI. So for example, let's say we're having AI help me write a letter to my parents and I have concerns about a child's dyslexia, and by accident I'm slipping a kid's name in there and the AI doesn't take out the name. It's those types of issues, I think, more from like a student safety and security is where we're seeing the conversation. Cooley did a really great panel a few weeks ago on it. And I think the big thing we're seeing from like a legal perspective of where is honestly the student safety and security pieces of like when you're entering things into AI to help you write that difficult conversation letter to a parent, what information is being fed into that system then that is private. Right. I think that's the big concerns that at least my like kind of legal brain starts to tingle a little when I'm talking to new businesses and clients and like how they're using the AI. And then it comes back to the creation standpoint, right? Like at the end of the day, we are creators here at Rye. We get paid to make lesson plans. You can only teach 2 + 2 so many creative ways until we're repeating things, right? At the end of the day, and good teaching practice is good practice. And so I think what we're also starting to see is if AI helps you make that lesson plan, where does the credit due? Right? And the citation of it. And so I think that's where we're starting to see issues. Do I love the idea of AI helping generate question prompts? Fantastic. But again, having that teacher check until we understand where the data goes. I mean, I recently just used Notebook that got released by Google. I think as an educator, it's thinking about teaching high schoolers how to write and organize data and media literacy. Fantastic application tool to use in classroom learning. But it's like when the calculator was introduced, right? Schools are going to struggle to think about how do we use this technology to also teach, but then for students to be able to show mastery, right? We see this with something like Copilot out of GitHub. We do professional learning for them. And the big talk we have when we talk to professors is like, how, my students need to learn how to use this in the workforce, right? This is going to be a tool that they use, but how do I also assess them in my classroom that they're showing mastery if they're utilizing this resource?
Well, I've got a bit of a out of left field question there in that case. You were talking a bit about how, Benoit, you mentioned earlier about how a lot of the education from the student's perspective seems to be, hey, we're kind of learning the same stuff regardless of where we're located. And now we're talking about AI, right? Which in the end is, I guess, look, there's different ways of building AI and how much data is being shared and not. But realistically, even the models that are out there today are built on the internet, right, of publicly available data. So as a school, and then there's this element of, schools have struggled traditionally in adopting technology, which is like mind-blowing. I mean, the example you gave from Germany is mind-blowing. It's one of the premier countries in the world, right, as far as technological advancement, you would think. I would wonder, what's the IP of a school in that context when you've got AI modeling, maybe even making lesson plans, running lessons, educating students? There's a certain, and Rayna, you said there's only so many ways you can teach 2 + 2. So at some point, is this, I don't want to kind of feed a soft question. I'm not really trying to feed a soft question, but is this a major threat, or a major shift to the way that we all learn? Or isn't it? Maybe I'm just overthinking it. Is this likely to just be really controlled by regulation and therefore just not enter the education space at all?
I mean, Rayna is probably going to give a much better answer than mine. And my sense is ultimately it is. There is no way that this doesn't affect the way we learn in the long term, right? Like the promise of personalized, structured feedback is to some degree the reason why tutoring, which is one of the few interventions that's been proven, to work across a number of different learning settings, works, is because you get that personalized learning intervention. The other reason that tutoring works is because you have real accountability and motivation to meet this person, on a regular basis, either because your parents are making you or because you've decided it's important, right? And that's, you don't get to hide in the way that you might in a classroom, right? If it turns out that motivation is like what's really driving it and not so much personalization, then there's still a long, or at least some way to go, right? Because in the current iteration, people don't act like they're very motivated by robots, or at least that's what we've seen, is that you can, even if the feedback is quite good, and it's not always quite good, but even when it is quite good, you don't feel accountable in that same way, so you don't show up, basically. And if you don't show up, then you can't learn. So I think just from a practical, putting the regulation stuff aside, which is probably, realistically, the things that is going to act as a real barrier or accelerant in the short term, the technology itself isn't quite there yet today for providing that. It's not that far, right? Like I could see, and it's not about like I personally, I could see like if there was a sassy robot that knew how to push my buttons, I would be accountable to that robot, right? Like I could see that completely, right? Making me more accountable than I feel today to, like, which I feel like it's more like a toy. But anyway, would love to hear like, from a practical standpoint, whether you think it, even if the technology worked, whether it's adoptable today. I have less of an opinion now.
I think, to me, it's more learning on how to work with it than like it teaching you and things like that. I think the biggest thing, I mean, this is me being an educator, is understanding how you learn, right? And because if you can unlock understanding how you as a person can understand and learn and acquire information, will help you the rest of your life, whether it be in the workplace, having to acquire a new skill, in college. Like, that is a key thing, is once you understand how you can teach yourself, how you best learn, and then you can employ technology like AI to help you. I think the big thing is we're going to have to teach students how to work with AI, because it's not going away. I don't know if the AI, and I think that's the difference of kind of framing with it, for me at least. And kind of even the example I gave earlier of like using Google Notebook and helping you write a paper better and getting that feedback. I think going back to what Whistle does, right? Like that sales and that marketing, like having that feedback engine of like, okay, how does this sound? How do I make this sound more sassy, right? Like, I'm sending this to Benoit. I need this email to sound sassy. How does this make it sound sassy to motivate him to do what I'm asking him to do, right? And I think using AI as a companion to stretch that learning and to help adapt content to the way that you learn and process will be a key skill for students to know and understand moving forward. Because I think regardless of what your job is going to be, I don't think AI is replacing everyone, but I think being able to work, the jobs that are able to work with AI will grow. And I think that's the important thing of understanding, no matter what field you go into, is like how you use this technology. And unfortunately, we ask so much of our teachers, and now we're going to ask one more thing. We're going to ask them to teach our next generation how to work with AI. And how we kind of in bring that. I think personalized learning is always so important. And at the end of the day, whatever we can do to empower our teachers to have more time to do that is really important. But unless AI is going to magically take away other things that are on teachers' plates, I don't know if it's going to work just that fast. Maybe that's what Magic School is all about. But I think that's the big piece. I think the concern is making sure that student information is safe and where things are going. I think the concerns that we're starting to see is, like, from a social emotional learning standpoint, we're seeing a lot of stuff around like AI therapy bots, things like that, and information getting out, tracking kids, and now it's searchable on the internet for the rest of his life. That in third grade, an AI bot thought this child had depression, and now this kid's applying for a job at the FBI, and he's 22, and it's being flagged. Right? That's the concerns that I'm at least seeing from a legal perspective and growth. And it's a new technology we don't know yet. And Benoit, you seem to agree with me on that point. I think that's where we are of the continuum. I think we're in that exploration phase. There's always going to be early adopters who get it and move. But I don't know if you're familiar with Presto. They do a fantastic stuff with AI and writing prompts. That's a great way for a teacher to start talking about AI, using AI, showing it in a classroom as a way to help brainstorm and grow, but not replace what you do, if that makes sense.
Let me just ask, just on, just to zoom for a second out of this topic, or to take it into the direction of education. Can you, Rayna, just from your experience, you've been on both sides of the classroom, right? How do institutions think about, and you've also mentioned, both of you have mentioned different kind of consideration sets that are there. How do these schools, universities actually go through the process of adopting or even considering technology and the changes? Can you walk us through what's the typical flow like?
So that's procurement, right? So usually they put out a request, right? For when they want something new. I would say where the discussion comes from generates from a lot of different places. Benoit might know more than me, but usually the best place to look at, if I'm trying to find some innovation, is looking at a strategic plan. So school districts put together a plan of what's usually a 3 to 5 year plan of what are our goals and how we're going to meet them over the next few years. I recommend kind of starting there. There's also kind of known districts that are more innovative. Houston Independent School District, for example, is pretty well known as an innovative school district. If you're looking to get into Texas, they're your early adopter district to go to. And usually it is applying through the procurement process, especially if you are this AI tech. They want to make sure the security and things are there. And they're going through getting that approval or going through for that pilot. And I guess something I didn't say earlier is pilots should always lead to purchase, right? So if you're doing a pilot, whether it be free, low cost, however you want to go about it, I don't think you should do free, but if you'd like to do a pilot free, you should be putting in your price point so they know what it is to actually purchase your product, whether you discount that to get to free because you're going to get a case study, they're going to do a video testimonial, etc. And that pilot should lead to purchase. And so when we're talking about new and innovative technology, things that are pushing the button, I always say going in as a pilot is a better way to approach it. But that's something that they can kind of think at. But it's really just kind of the early adopter pilot piece. I also think look to LinkedIn, look to the news media. Who is talking about this stuff? That's how you find your early adopters. Those are the people who are getting published or blogging about things. Those are the people who are going to be more willing to pilot and be engaged in your technology. And then you'll see the requests. We actually are starting to see district level requests for AI consultants. We've seen some in Utah and California and Hawaii at this point.
Yeah, I would just add, sorry, just a tag on that. I think honestly, you're much more likely to sell if the thing that you're solving is not somebody's lack of innovation, but somebody's real problem, right? Nobody wakes up, or very few people. There are a couple directors of innovation whose job it is to find innovation, but the vast majority of people in an educational setting, particularly in K-12 and universities, have other jobs, and really the way you get their attention is to say, hey, I can make your job a lot easier, right? So the company in our portfolio is probably growing the fastest in the U.S. is a company called Zen Educate. They're a marketplace for for substitute teachers, right? They're called supply teachers in the UK. And they're not. I mean, there is a technological platform that is underlying that process. But what they're saying is hey, they're going to schools and they're saying, hey, are you having a hard time getting staffing your substitute teachers? And almost every school. Some significant percentage of school districts in the country are saying, yes, that is a problem that we have. Can you help us solve that problem? And they're like, yeah, we can do it. And there's technology that's a part of it, but and here's why we do it better than other folks, right? And so I think that's there's some probably AI integrations on the fringes of what they're doing, but honestly, the down the middle thing is we will get you a qualified teacher, into your classroom for both short-term and long-term placement, more efficiently than any other way, and that's why they started in the UK, but they're live now in 5 cities, including Houston. So I'm not surprised to hear. And one of the things they're doing is, I think in Texas they did go through the hunt and process, but like the other thing that's important for anybody who's studying into K-12 in the U.S., particularly to understand, is you can start with charter schools who often have, or independent or private schools that often have less rigorous procurement processes, and being live in Houston in some of those charter schools and independent schools was key to them actually signing the school district itself. Same thing in Minneapolis. Same thing in I think in Anaheim. Actually, they went directly to school district, but they're sort of in those places, and it helps to kind of jumpstart the process.
So just to kind of highlight a couple of points that we in the conversation today. One of them is that it seems like there is, whether we want to call it fractioning or, breaking apart of independence, let's say, right? The creation of more independent thinking happening across the US, which seems to mimic the way that European institutions have traditionally always worked, which has meant that, companies looking to approach or working on a one-to-one level with each of these different jurisdictions or schools, universities that they're looking to work with. There seems like there's, in some ways, more red tape, which has been passed on to the vendor. I think, Rayna, as you shared, which good move from the school's perspective, because that's a lot of work from everyone's side. It seems like all technology does go through quite a lot of consideration, and from Benoit, from what you were sharing, is that the more that it affects in a positive way the core problems that the school's looking to solve, the more likely it's going to be considered than something on the fringes, or just, it's cool, right? It's cool is not enough of a reason maybe to make the list. Rayna, you walked us through almost like two sides, right? There's solutions that solve the problems that are the spine of the institution. There's solutions that solve maybe some of the fringe problems that they deal with, which might be more likely to be shared across a number of different vendors to solve those problems. The core problems, if I'm remembering correctly, are likely to be awarded to one winner of the RFP. Okay. And then we spoke just a little bit about one of the things that attracts whether it's investors or founders to the space is the fact that, yes, it is hard to sell technology to schools and universities. I've done it a lot myself. We've all been in the ecosystem. We've seen what goes on. But predictability and reduction of churn is a pretty important trend going into the next year. Growth was the theme for a long time. Now it seems like, hey, investors, Benoit, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like investors are valuing a predictable, scalable business model. And so if you are selling into the education space, yes, it's hard to get into. You've got to jump through a couple of hoops. Maybe you have to do POCs or pilots or freemiums or what have you. But once you do get in, once you are trusted, and once you are able to build those relationships and solve real problems, then you've got a long-term client with low churn. And then one of the things that I liked, which we didn't discuss, but from my experience selling into the space, each institution, for better or worse, has a number of different problems that you can solve. So if you're trusted to solve one and you have an ability to solve more than one, the fact that you were trusted to solve this previous one makes you much more likely to get those secondary contracts. Just before we wrap up this section, I'm just curious if there's any other tips, trends, highlights, or things that you think that people who are listening should be aware of coming into 2024 in the world of EdTech, whether it's from the institution's perspective or from the founders or tech companies' perspective.
I think building off what you just shared, kind of like that consistency comes down to a funding process, right? Like how they're going to pay for you. I think there's been lots of different funding that's been cut because of the pandemic, but making sure that you can align clearly to a funding bucket from the ESSA tiers, because those dollars are not going away, are going to be important to be able to show that consistency of sale when it comes to the US market. So being able to say, okay, I align to tier two. And then this is how. So when the funding kind of dries up, when we have this cliff, plateau, etc., you're able to show that I can still be purchased and have that consistency, and also be prepared for a volume year discount. Having that pricing ready and being able to be flexible with that is going to be really important to be thinking about as schools start to rethink their budgets and how their spending allocations going, and being flexible in that. So like a great example I love for early stage companies is thinking about like their professional learning and onboarding can be paid for with Title II funds. Use that as a Trojan horse, right? So we're going to make our professional learning cost a little bit more, and maybe the tech product costs a little bit less, and we can sneak in under Title II funds instead of just Title I, right? Understanding, knowing how to apply those ESSA dollars to your product so that there's a clear funding source for you moving forward is going to be really important, and understanding your pricing enough to be able to manipulate and work well with districts on how to get that purchase done from a volume side, I think is going to be really important moving forward.
Such a great lesson. How will they pay for you? What a great question for any founder to ask themselves. Benoit, anything you want to share just as we wrap up part one that we might have missed?
Yeah, no, we haven't talked much about universities, but I would say one sort of thing that universities will be looking for more now than ever is just software that unlocks revenue for them, and that can be either because it brings a new revenue stream directly to the university, or because it helps them acquire students more cheaply, or retain them for longer. There are a number of different ways, but I think universities are under a tremendous amount of pressure, and it's made them less probably apt to adopt technology than they have in the past. But our sort of experience is that if you have a real revenue solution for them, they jump on that quite quickly. And so yeah, I think it's worth paying attention to.
I like how we ended up on the points of 1, consider how they're going to pay for you, and then 2, consider how you're going to make them money. 2 that I don't think either anyone would think about in this space. Thank you very much, Benoit. Thank you very much, Rayna. It's been an absolute pleasure. And for everybody else, please tune in for part 2. It's coming very, very soon.